When you've finished the functionality, put some polish on it and tested your application, it's time to ship it. So what final stage do we need to look at to get the application out of the door? So far we've been doing everything in development mode. We've been developing locally, so network latency and bandwidth have not been a problem. When we ship it out to a server which our users can access, however, that's going to be a big deal. Let's just pause and look at what our application does to the network. That's a little over 5.5 megabytes transferred before we even load the login screen. First, let's see what we can do with the CSS. The compiled CSS for our theme is already fairly well compressed, but we can improve on the calendar CSS we took from Ext. Let's include this in the theme processing instead with a Sass include. To do this, we can just add the calendar source into our custom theme, which means it will be compiled along with the theme. Now we just run a Sencha app rebuild and the CSS has been embedded. That will improve things a bit, but we're still loading a huge amount of JavaScript, both in terms of size and more importantly in terms of the number of requests. We'll deal with that in the next video. In the previous videos, we've used the Sencha command to build themes, generate some models, and do some basic debug building. It's the Sencha command that we'll want to go back to make our final build. Let's run the Sencha app build command as we did before, but this time we'll add production to set the environment. If we look in the build directory, we now have a production folder. This contains a JavaScript file called all classes and a resources directory which now contains everything that our application needs. The file has bundled in our application code and the relevant sections of the Ext framework. We can see the effect of this on file sizes if we compare it to the bundled Ext all file in the Ext distribution. We find our output file is already smaller, even with all our application code. The compiler goes through our code and interprets the requires members and any calls to Ext require to ensure that we're only bringing in those chunks of a framework that our application uses. When we were in dev mode, you may have noticed the occasional warning in the console about synchronous loading components. These will not be picked up by the compiler, so we need to make sure that we add the right requires entries to remove them before building the production version. Earlier in the course, we looked at the advantages of dynamic loading for certain sections of our application. Now we have a mechanism which is building everything into a single request. We need to rethink this approach a little. However, it's still perfectly possible. Sencha command has a rich series of commands for creating certain sets of classes and computing the intersection between them to create a common library and section-specific extra libraries. This is described in depth in the docs, specifically in the section about multi-page applications. We can use the build settings to control how these are compiled and break our application into different pages to take advantage of the build system. For example, we might want to separate out the charting components. Since we created a rough sketching area which matches that part of the application already, it's simple to take that page and generate different sets of classes from it, then compare them against the main application and pull out the common and differing sets. We now have three main class outputs: the charting specific parts, the main application only bits, and a set that is a cross between the two. This means we can keep chunks of our application lean. Something to note here is that the technique we're using is a bit tricky with standard MVC architecture single-page applications like the one we're building here, but works great for multi-page projects which have an Ext application for each page.